Now, there was another alternative, and this is the one that really relates to us directly. We never had in America, and hopefully we never will, have the kind of centralized authority that's quite common in France. You know, I know because my wife's family's from France, and I know what centralized authority is all about. The British had a different idea. By the way, this is the city of Perth, Australia. And basically, Ebenezer Howard had this idea that, well, why don't we just take people from the city and move them out into what had been the countryside, and have them live in an area where they would have more space, it would be cleaner, it would be a better environment. And so Howard really came up with this idea of what was called the Garden City. And in many ways, what Thousand Oaks is a garden city. It is a form of urbanism that basically is, it's not the countryside, it's not huge estates, but it's houses dominated by single-family houses in which people have a certain amount of space, and there's a huge emphasis on parks. And if you can go to some of the towns he designed, they're still that way. Now, the place that became the center of this, and really the innovator, was here in Southern California. This is in 1905, and you can see what the idea of LA. LA was very different. Up until LA, basically, in Southern California, every city that competed wanted to be like New York or Chicago. That was the idea. High-rise, big downtown, high density, and then you would have bedroom communities around it. LA was, from the very early time, this is 1905, they said, we're going to have a different kind of city. We're going to have a city of dispersed small towns and villages connected in those days by the streetcar, and those places would be much more human. So there was the idea of, as one minister called it, he called it the better city, that they didn't want to do what had been done in the Midwest and the Northeast, or even in a city like New Orleans. They wanted to create this new way of living in a city that was much more human scale and much more harmonious with nature. And this was the basic idea of Southern California. And in the early days, this appealed to a great many of the people who first came to Southern California, who were predominantly from towns in the Midwest, where they were used to kind of a small town feel. And that was the early history of LA. So LA became sort of the innovator, and over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, it continued to develop along almost all the lines that we now know. For instance, first you had the sort of streetcar suburb, and you had, well, where I live in the San Fernando Valley neighborhood from the 1930s, a sort of very heavily treed kind of environment that was connected in some ways to the central core. But then you had the planned communities. Of course, one of the earliest big planned communities was Valencia. Another one was Irvine. And as you go out in this direction, you started to see that the idea was to replicate this idea. Obviously, you know, in a more modern sense, more car, less transit. But nevertheless, the idea of creating in the city a human environment. And I would argue that your long-term success will be determined in part by how well you maintain that environment. You know, when people say, well, you know, the suburban areas need to become really high density and they need to have all these large buildings. Well, if you do that, then you have sort of thrown away what you have. You know, there will be more density. I think, you know, you're constrained with land. But keep your eye on the idea that what is it that you're trying to create? What kind of environment are you trying to create? What is your competitive advantage against other people and against other regions here in Southern California? And I think it really stems on staying true, at least to the idea of how we do that. Now, we will have to do that differently in the future. You know, for instance, we're going to probably over time see that there aren't going to be very many lawns anymore. There'll be more of drought-resistant plants. You know, we need to have more tree cover to keep things cooler. But nevertheless, the ideal that goes back to the, to the very earliest times is the one that I think, particularly for a community like this, which really has a primary sales point, is its quality of life. That is really at the center of what you want to preserve. Now, there are those who say that suburbs are dead. They're finished. This is our brilliant HUD secretary, Sean Donovan, saying, "We've reached the limits of suburban development. People are beginning to vote with their feet and come back to the central cities." Too bad he didn't talk to the Commerce Department, take a look at the census. Yes, there has been a growth, and I'll show you some charts on this in some of the central cores, including downtown LA, but actually there's been depopulation of much of the area around it, and almost all the growth is actually on the periphery. Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, most people for most of their lives, I would say at least 30 to 75 to 80, are going to want to live in a, not necessarily a very low density environment, but a lower density environment. So if we take a look at America today, you can see, where do Americans live? About 40% live in suburbs. About 14.6 live in core cities, and that's even overestimating it, because actually about 6% of Americans live in densities of 10,000 per square mile, and my neighborhood is about that, about 10,000. There are very few neighborhoods that are in 50,000, 75,000, which is what you have in Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn. And about 45% of Americans live in either small towns or small cities or villages. So this is sort of where Americans live today. Then where has the growth been? So this is from the 2000 census, 2000 to 2010. So over this period, you had growth in the downtown south. This was a very good thing. It's a good thing to have happened. About 200,000 people across the country moved into what we would call the central core. That would be within 2 miles of the downtown area. We usually do it from the point of City Hall. But then you can see that the population in the areas around 2 to 5 miles actually declined. Like, for instance, and I'll show you in LA, you had growth in downtown LA, but Pico Union and some of the areas around downtown LA have actually depopulated, in large part because the children of the immigrants have moved elsewhere. And so very often the grandma and the great-grandma may be still there, but the family is no longer there. The growth was more modest in the 5 to 10 miles, about 1 million, 3.4 at 10 to 15 miles, 3 million, 15 to 20 miles, and 8.5 million out further, like 20 miles plus. So this has been the pattern. Now, there are those who say, well, this has all changed. After the great real estate bust, people don't want to live this way anymore. They're all, as Sean Donovan suggests, moving to the city. So we decided to take a look at what's actually been happening after the end of the housing bubble. And what we found is, and this is actually work that was done by Trulia, the urban core had good growth in that year, very modest growth as you get further out, and the big growth continues to be in the suburban areas. Now, the biggest growth was not in the very far suburb, but probably in something more equivalent to Thousand Oaks. So this pattern of people moving out, so in other words, what you have here is still valued. It's still a product that has a tremendous appeal, and as I'll show you, will have a big appeal to the demographic forces that will shape the future, particularly here in Southern California. So one of the main things is, this is always the question that I'm always amazed by, why don't you ask people what they want? So this was actually, Smart Growth America did this survey, and that they found is about 80% of people, when you ask them what they want a single-family house. Now, there's always going to be a market for higher density, and there are going to be people who prefer it, and particularly people who don't have children or people who are single are much more likely to prefer this. But right now, about 80% want a detached house. Now, I think that number may drop in the future for some demographic reasons, and more for the fact that economically they can't afford it. But this is a very appealing thing. So when you think about your basic form and the basic housing stock you have, don't think of it as a disadvantage, but as an advantage. Doesn't mean you can't enhance it, doesn't mean you can't have some higher density development. But this is the product that people want. And time again, once there is any kind of economic recovery, we immediately start to see a shift to suburbia. By the way, that also included in office space the last 2 years as well. Now, what about Southern California? So we did these numbers. We did these are for you. We did a lot of number crunching. In Southern California, you see there's a little bump in the downtown area between 2000 and 2010, a reduction in the area 5 miles out, and then you can see where the big growth is, 40 miles out being the highest growth. So fundamentally, Southern California has also maintained the same pattern. The people still are looking to go further out as opposed to further in. And then if we take it in a pie chart, you can see basically the vast majority of the growth, with under 10 miles was only 1% of the growth. Most of the growth went elsewhere. People continue to search for a house. Now, if they can find a house closer in and they can afford it, that's still very attractive, and they tend to go pretty quickly. But the basic form you have is still very attractive and is where most of the growth has taken place. The other question is, this is another survey that we looked at, where do people prefer to live? And there's a group, maybe 8% who would like to live in an urban core downtown area, about 11% in a city residential area, but the vast majority are looking for either suburban, small town, or a rural area. So then you ask them what kind of housing they want, and of course you get this same answer. And here's an interesting thing. Preferred is 80% and 70% actually live in a single family house. So what that tells you is there is a pent-up demand for that product over time. Not that many people want to live in an apartment if they don't have to. The townhouse is pretty well, and what we might call the townhome is like an attached product. It has about a 7% market, but basically single-family homes are still preferred. So what this means in the future, one of the things that's constantly said is suburbs, okay, they were great, they did wonderfully, everybody wanted, and now nobody wants to live in them, and that all the new groups that are going to shape the future, which are basically what I call the canaries in the coal mine. The immigrants, who are particularly important here in Southern California, and their children, the aging boomers, people like me, getting into their 50s and 60s, and the millennials, which is basically the children of the boomers. It could be called the echo boomers, it could be called Generation Y. These are the three groups who are going to be the dominant forces in where we go in the future.